Hi, everyone. This is Tina Ramirez, and I'm so excited to be with you today to introduce you to my good friend, Bob Fu with ChinaAid. Bob has been somebody that I've known since, I don't know, for the last 15, 20 years. And one of those heroes that I've known in my life when I think of people around the world that have lived through suffering and persecution themselves, then gone out and risked their lives in defense of others, I think of Bob. So I'm just honored to have you here with me, Bob. Thank you. You're all the way from, another part of the world, I'm sure right now, but thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Tina. It's always a joy and privilege to talk with you. And I'm so glad to be on this show.
Well, so let me give everybody a little bit of background, Bob. We first met when I was working, I'm not sure, I think it was when I was working in the US Congress. And yeah. You are the preeminent expert on everything China. And so we became good friends because you would often come up and I helped coordinate numerous hearings where you got to testify and share what was happening in China. And China is always in the news. It's the largest country in the world. And so, and not only that, but one of the worst violators of so many human rights, and in particular, the rights of freedom of conscience and belief for so many people. So, so your background, you're the president and founder of ChinaAid. You established it in 2002. But prior to that, you actually are from China, and you were a house church leader there with your wife in the underground kind of church movement, which I want to hear all about. And eventually you had to flee and come to the United States in 1997, but you I believe saw the Tiananmen Square attacks. You've lived through a lot. And I want to hear the story about what happened at the United Nations when you tried to share with them what actually happens in China. But we can't turn on the news anymore without hearing China front and center every day. And so this is really such an honor and just a privilege for me to be able to share, because you have a perspective on China that very few people do. So thank you for doing this with me today.
Well, thank you, Tina. You are my hero too. I'm on the hill, and everybody knows you are the person to go for everything about religious freedom around the globe when you're working in Congress. And I'm so thankful now you are continuing your calling to be the voice for those voiceless.
Well, Bob, when you were in China, and I think that's like kind of a great segue, when you were in China and having a house church, how important is it to have somebody on the outside that hears you and that can be a voice for you? Share a little bit about growing up in China, what was happening, and the importance of just knowing that there was somebody that was going to be a voice for you.
Oh, it's so critical. And excuse me.
I think it's so easy for us here in the West to take for granted having a voice. We see people using it quite expressively over the internet all the time. But in countries like China, having a voice and being heard is a life or death reality. And so you lived that reality because you wanted to live according to your conscience. And I think that people need to understand, what does that actually look like? What was happening in China at the time when, before you left? What did you get involved with, and how did you try to have a voice? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's just so critical to have that voice from the outside world to show their care and to really advocate and be a voice for them. And I remembered, of course, I was born and raised under communism, Marxism. We call it dialectical materialism. And from childhood to graduate school, we were always taught that the government is the answer. The Chinese Communist Party, Chairman Mao is our savior. Everything we do, we have to depend on that almighty government and the Communist Party. Until 1989 came, I was one of the students leaders from my university, actually camping, stationing in the Tiananmen Square when millions of other students were marching together for democracy, for freedom, and for as simple as anti-corruption, for a clean government. And then, as the world watched, I think you remember watching on TV that when the so-called People's Government of China sent its so-called People's Liberation Army with the tanks, with machine guns, rule over and murdered and really massacred hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent citizens. So my first really kind of disillusion happened was, where is that kind of almighty government? The government actually, instead of protecting us, start murdering us. And that really was the turning point for my spiritual life during that time, while I was being politically persecuted for being a leader in the democracy movement. As a student, I was totally disappointed, in despair, and really disillusioned. And then it was through the American English teachers who were actually, secret missionaries. I got heard the gospel of Jesus Christ for the first time. And that's how I realized, well, to have some money and material modernization or more technology are important, but these things cannot change one's life. And to have even a good political system, as this described, is a good thing, but no political system can change a heart. Especially when I learned some of my friends even betrayed me by telling lies in order to show their loyalty to the Communist Party. So that was a deep disappointment on the human nature. And so I was full of hatred as well. So I was really, during that time, looked or sought or found by this gracious God. So that's how I became a follower of Christ. When I read that powerful words, it says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. That's the turning point for my life. And so that's how my Christian faith journey started. And then a major spiritual revival swept across China after the massacre. Literally millions of Chinese students, intellectuals, for the first time, maybe in 100 years, start just gathering in the church or coming to Christian faith. And then I started a house church in Beijing. And oh, sorry, my voice is a little bit.
Bob, I would love to understand. So you were sharing that, prior to Tiananmen Square, as a college student, the government had been really pushing these Marxist communist ideas on you, trying to indoctrinate students, but there was this resistance. And finally, people stood up for basic rights, anti-corruption, but freedom of conscience against the government, this government system that was pretending like it was there to be their savior, be their protector, but actually was there to destroy them and individual rights and dignity. So you stood up to that. And after that is when this wave overtook the whole country, because people must have been pretty disillusioned by the government at that point, and realizing that the government was pretending to offer them everything, but at basically the cost of their entire lives, and that wasn't worth the cost. All those false promises and hopes of socialism and communism were not worth the cost of losing.
It's really a utopia.
Yeah. So there really was no utopia. So students became disillusioned. They began to turn to faith as a response, because they wanted some kind of hope that there was more out there, and that there is a higher God or a higher power than what the government wants to dictate and play God. But People wanted to choose that for themselves. And so you saw this shift. So the house church movement started. How big did it grow across China?
Oh my goodness. I mean, in Beijing, when I was just moved to Beijing to study in my graduate school time, the American missionary teachers teaching English in Beijing University told me that was in 1990s, early 90s. There were over 500 Bible study groups in that one university alone. I mean, it's just exploding. It is in every universities. When I hosted a kind of a Thanksgiving party, we call it, by renting a hotel conference room, I mean, over 400 some students showed up. I mean, we didn't, do any advertisement. It was just, students share with each other, said there's a party, a Thanksgiving party, and we just share some testimony. When I made a altar call, half of them raised their hands and become a new followers of Christ as new Christians. It's a phenomenal. I mean, in my university alone, I was perhaps the first generation of Chinese Christians after 6 years of our American missionary English teachers were labor. And in the past 20 plus years, a church was even planted next to the campus. And I was told over 10,000 students and professors were baptized from that university alone. So that's how the kind of faith vacuum, they call it, was filled by this dynamic Christian faith. Yeah.
And so what happened, Bob, after, so you're a leader in the house church movement, you're seeing this explosion. I'm sure that the government doesn't like it. So what happened?
Well, that's the kind of, what do you call, I came short of a word, paradox. Yeah, that's kind of a paradox. A paradigm of paradox. On the one hand, the kind of explosion has been going on. On the other hand, the persecution has never stopped, of course, since the time of Chairman Mao took in power in 1949. So the communist government basically could not tolerate any authentic faith that is seen independent of its total absolute control. So that's why I was in trouble when Heidi and I planted a student church in Beijing, and later on we established an independent kind of underground Bible training school or seminary type. And then in 1996, my wife and I, were both arrested for being accused of engaging illegal religious activities or illegal evangelism. And we were put into a prison for 2 months for that. And I started I called prison theology intensive course over there. But I do see more the need for the gospel. I mean, every one of these prisoners in my prison cell every day begging me to share the gospel, and they are totally desperate and being persecuted inside the prison. The prison guards treat them as dogs. I mean, even worse than dogs. I mean, one round of interrogation, when they returned, most of them just had to crawl into the cell with the leg or arm broken, bleeding, electric shock baton, I mean, all over, kind of tortured them. So that is for those like ordinary criminals, so-called, like a thief, even like a corrupted party official, or like a drug addict. So that's how they were treated. So they want to know where's the hope, I mean, for their soul, and where is the their future, and how can they get them. So I was as busy, if not busier, as like a missionary in the prison cell, I was ministering outside the prison.
And your wife was in prison too. So what
Yes,
happened?
exactly.
What happened and how did you end up leaving China? What motivated that?
Yeah, so she was in a women's cell prison section. I didn't realize that until one day when during the interrogation, one of the interrogators told me, said, "Oh, your wife is much more stubborn than you." You know, I was actually very happy to hear that. That means, you know, my wife did not share any house church, you know, information to them. And I took comfort during that time, you know, even the stubbornness of women could be a great virtue, you know, I said, and facing the interrogation. And then, of course, later on, when we were both released, we were put under house arrest. And then my wife was pregnant without pregnancy permit, you know, under this communist evil family planning system. For those of us, I was kind of like serving as an English teacher in the Chinese Communist Party school. That's God's humor. And so my daytime job was teaching English to these Communist Party leaders. My evening time and the weekend, I was an underground church pastor. No wonder they were very upset at me. And so we have to apply for a quota, even for the first child after you married. We got married, you know, that was 3 years already. We couldn't get a quota to for Heidi to get pregnant, you know, a legal pregnancy. Otherwise, she's facing a forced abortion. I mean, we have so many friends. I mean, they have already kind of gone through that misery. These women being forced to, you know, put on the hospital bed, on clinic bed, and with 2 doses of poison drugs and induced into the stomach, and the baby was forcibly aborted, and some were aborted alive. I mean, still moving. I mean, this is perhaps the largest, I mean, crime against humanity in human history. The Chinese Communist Party proudly claimed they had successfully prevented over 300 million babies from being born in the past 2 decades. I mean, at least over half of them were forcefully aborted. Almost every woman, you know, in China had to suffer on this. And that's another topic. But anyway, so we decided to fled out of Beijing without any clue that we would be able to get out of China. But by God's grace, you know, after our baby, I mean, you know, was being checked, you know, during the pregnancy of Heidi in the countryside while we're hiding by the barefoot doctors. You know, this we couldn't get any government hospital to even do a medical check. Everybody, including Christian doctors, were kind of scared to death and basically try every way to tell us no way, just to leave, just to go. So we also were facing imminent rearrest because the state security agents every day try to force us to report, to betray our brothers and sisters. Every phone call, every visitor, we have to report. So that's how we fled, and by God's grace, miraculously, you know, we were able to escape to Hong Kong first, and that's when Hong Kong was still under British control. And our first baby, our son Daniel, was born actually as maybe the youngest refugee in Hong Kong hospital. And 3 days before Hong Kong was handed over to China. And God used Bill Clinton and many other Christians who had been praying all over the world for us. And we were accepted as refugees to the United States of America, the land of free. That was June 27th, 1997. We would have never, you know, forgotten that day of freedom. landed into the US. That's kind of our journey.
Wow, that is a remarkable journey. I don't think any of us can live half of that in our lives, let alone in, the just the first half of our lives, let alone, everything that you faced since. So, what a remarkable journey. What, I think that a lot of people don't really understand so much about what was happening in communist China at the time, why people were fleeing, the realities of what you had to face there. I mean, really, literally not having any freedom, not freedom of conscience, not freedom of movement, not freedom to marry who you want, have children. I mean, every single freedom was limited and stifled. You had the government literally dictate which churches. You had like the Three Self movement permitted only certain religious communities that were government controlled, government organized, and everybody else was illegal. I mean, it's just amazing how things change so rapidly in
Yes.
China. And I'm sure that it was so interesting for you, I'm sure, to be seeing, how even right now in the news with what's happening in Hong Kong, to see Hong Kong reverse and literally go through those same changes that China went through previously. I think that must be really hard to watch right now.
Very hard. I mean, that's, as you just said, that short, I call it intensive course of prison theology, 2 months in the Communist Party's prison, really gave me some sense like why we should never forget to speak up, to really do something for our fellow persecuted, faithfuls. I mean, that's how we established the Ministry of ChinaAid. Basically, is to work with these persecuted by exposing the abuses of the Communist Party's persecution, by encouraging these abused, and by equipping them, so that they can fight better for their freedom. I mean, the Communist Party in the past, 5-6 years, under this new president, President Xi Jinping, whose nickname is called Chairman Mao Jr., it has become really the worst. In terms of religious freedom, that we have not seen since the Cultural Revolution in 1960s. The beauty of Chinese Communist Party is that the China's constitution has written all these beautiful freedoms you just mentioned. The Chinese citizens is guaranteed with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, religious belief, and everything. But in reality, nothing. Not only not being guaranteed, it's just everything's being violated. So we have to speak up for them. We every day, since we arrived in the US, we just receiving tons of calls, information, requests for help and for support, for rescue. Those brothers and sisters, I could hear their voice literally live during the night. It was the China's daytime, when the police and the public security officers knocking their doors, start moving their furnitures and beating up their parents in front of children's cry. That really keep us alive. Keep us here today. We couldn't really silent on that, right, in front of this kind of evil. I remembered when in 2009, when one day I received a message said, the wife and 2 children of a human rights lawyer, Gao Zhisheng, escaped to Thailand. In Bangkok. I think, you were already in the DC in Congress, right? And so I just could not sleep because, that night, immediately, I bought my most maybe expensive flights overnight, heading to Bangkok. and the poor, the mother and two children. I mean, the father, attorney Gao Zhisheng, perhaps he's called the conscience of China, and he was selected as one of the 10 best lawyers by the Chinese own Justice Department before he was totally struck down after he started advocacy. Speaking up for those tortured, thousands of tortured Falun Gong practitioners and Christians. He wrote an open letter to the Chinese president and premier. That got him into trouble. He lost his license, then his whole law firm, his whole family. Literally, dozens of Chinese public security officers would stay in his house 24 hours a day for weeks. They have to force the Gao Zhisheng's wife basically to have the light on. And when I met with their daughter, Grace, and she was showing me her scars on her arm. She was not allowed to go to school alone, has to take a police car. And when she was in in her high school, and she was called in public by the security officers, her father is a mafia head. She was beaten up in front of the gate of her school for refusing to take on the police car. And she said, I miss my school, after she was basically forced to stop her schooling. And she couldn't hold. She was trying to commit suicide multiple times. And so that's the story when I learned, when I went to Bangkok, hearing that from them. She said, even when she took a shower, the police officer, security agents forced her to have the shower door open. Can you imagine, for little, young teenager being followed 24 hours a day without any privacy? That's how we rescued them into the US and to speak up. The father was being tortured with even toothpick when he was naked and against his sexual organs. It was just that kind of torture. He was a twice, Nobel Peace nominee, prize nominee. And that's the CCP has been treating this family like that.
So if somebody comes after the government, speaks out, they're completely silenced. So you talked about Gao, and I remember because I was in Congress at the time, we were having hearings about it. We were trying to get the US government to engage with the Chinese government on this. So his family eventually escaped and is now here. What happened to Gao?
Well, after he was released after suffering more than 8 years in the hands of the state security agents and underground basement interrogations, torture in the most horrible way. And he finally was released 3 years ago. Then we decided to kind of have an interview with him. And he really wants to speak out about his experience. And so AP arranged a secret interview in a cave. He was released to his hometown in the remote mountain area. And then we smuggled out his manuscript of the book, then with the ABA, American Bar Association, and decided basically publish it. And then he was disappeared again. It's over 3 years already. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody is being told what his condition is. In fact, just yesterday, his wife, Miss Gong He, issued a public statement, said, she now has raised the two children now to the college age already, and she's ready to go back to China to be in the same prison with her husband, dead or alive. She wants to see him, after almost 10 years of a separation, and no news at all. So that's, the kind of thing I think we are facing, this evil regime.
You started ChinaAid in 2002, and I started working in Washington around 2004. So we met shortly thereafter.
That's right.
Literally, but you've been working on these things for 19, 20 years in Washington, essentially. And it must be so frustrating for you to see how people in America now are embracing communist Marxist ideas, and how even different political politicians are embracing the Chinese Communist Party as though they're a friend. I mean, how do you feel about that when you literally see what the Chinese have done to innocent people, to human rights activists, to families? I mean, I can't imagine as a mother. I fight for human rights all over the world, as you do, Bob. And I think, one of the things that I think about is I'm willing to put my life at risk for myself. But if it affected my daughter, my child, like it did to Gao and his child, that's where you really think twice. And that had to be one of the hardest things, where he didn't want to violate his conscience, but he knew in not violating his conscience and standing up for the dignity of others, that literally his daughter was going to go to school every day and suffer, that these police officers were watching her in the shower, that she would not have any freedom simply because of the convictions of his own heart. And that must have been a really hard place. But thank goodness for people like you who have, through ChinaAid, helped so many of these Chinese dissidents and activists that have given their voice for so many others at risk of their own life. But tell me, just as you see the policies towards China changing, this friendship and this embrace of Marxism and communism and the country that you fled to for freedom, how do you feel about that?
I'm glad you asked that question. That is perhaps the most frustrating and intriguing experience and evolvement. I think really in the past decade or so, and I feel I'm observing this dangerous trend of American young people, especially being brainwashed by this notion that, socialism or something part of communism would do no harm to our society. And the kind of a utopia described by Chinese Communist Party has been being repeated in American universities, campus, from high school to graduate school. And so this is really what communism is, from millions of Chinese people's experience. Communism means death. In the past 70 years under China's Communist Party's rule, at least according to historians, between 80 to maybe 90 million lives were murdered, killed, massacred under Chairman Mao's rule.
And that's not counting, like you said, the unborn children.
Oh yeah,
murdered in mother's wombs.
Oh, this number does not even count. This unborn, and they are master for deception. So that's communism. Master for false propaganda. Master for lies. I mean, this COVID thing also, the whole world has been suffering, is a direct product and casualty because of the Chinese Communist Party lies. I mean, I think left or right, no matter which ideology you're standing in, just look at the basic research of the starting of the COVID-19 and the first few months. What the Chinese Communist Party has done, they are covering up. They are lying to the world. They are locked down Wuhan city, without letting anyone getting out. At the same time, they allow hundreds of thousands of Chinese flying to Europe, to the United States, and still telling the world it's not infection, commuted through human to human, while hundreds of thousands are infected and died already, and died on the street instantly, on the hospital, on the hospital hall. We know all of that. They're still lying. They're still not really telling the truth. And they are in not only themselves, they make the WHO as their slave. In the International Health Organization would totally co-opted by the Communist Party of China to make this tragic, kind of a pandemic even worse, right? So how can we trust this ideology of socialism, communism, when they are full of lies? So I was just really, wanting to tell the American younger generation, if you really kind of want to know a little bit about socialism, communism, just to spend 2 weeks in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Havana, and just try to carry one gospel tracts or any of your religious literatures. If you believe in Buddhism, believe Islam, just to go to the Tiananmen Square and pass 10, you would know what happened to you under the Chinese socialism and communism. That means communism, and that means socialism. So do you want that to happen in the United States of America, in our town, in our city, in our neighborhood, where you couldn't exercise your freedom of speech? So we're not even anti-atheism. ChinaAid and you too, Tina, we believe religious freedom for all, for everyone, everywhere, all the places. So we're not discriminating even against atheism. We're fighting for their freedom of expression. One of the sarcastic or irony thing happening in China is, even you are distributing the Red Book of a Communist Charter, the manifesto. If you print hundreds, or thousands, and start distributing at Tiananmen Square, you will be arrested too, because you did that without explicit authorization by the Communist Party. So that's kind of thing we are facing, I think, in this. In this great society in the United States. I'm just very, very worried.
Bob, let's talk about something that I wasn't planning on talking about, but the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated the United States college system as well. And I know that Frank Wolf had worked on this, the US congressman, for a long time, trying to, force our government to acknowledge and to recognize that a lot of programs were being established across the United States that were literally being funded by the Chinese Communist Party on college campuses. And this was actually a national security threat. And I think that a lot of those programs have been dismantled because of the national security implications. But can you talk about that and what is actually happening in our colleges?
Oh, absolutely, Tina. The Communist Party's propaganda, the infiltration, has been already very deep in our college, university campuses. For instance, this so-called Confucius Institute, it's just so unbelievable to me as somebody, from the Communist China, being persecuted over there, to see somehow this Confucius Institute, so-called, that fully funded and managed and even supplied by the, with the personnel, the teachers, totally by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese propaganda department, and had now been allowed, operated in this, especially Ivy League elite universities and even public universities too, to brainwash our campus students to somehow, to beautify the ruthless, ruling of the Communist Party, they would not allow, folks like you and me, or Dalai Lama, or Rabir Kadir from Uyghur communities to give any, talks or speeches. But yet, they're telling the Chinese, the American students that, oh, China has everything settled, everything's beautiful, nicely, there's no problems. And that is kind of the infiltration so deep, that they want to poison our next generation. And yes.
What they were doing on these college campuses is essentially setting up these Confucian institutes, fully funded. But it wasn't just that. Once these institutions were in colleges across the United States, they were then using them to silence any other kind of dissent on the campus against communism, against the ideas of the Chinese Communist Party, but also against China. And so can you talk a bit about that and what was actually happening? So it wasn't just like, oh, we're here to better understand communism.
No, it's not about cultural.
It was an entry point to be able to stifle any kind of criticism and with national security implications. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's not just all as simple as it's an institution for cultural exchange, teaching you to speak a few Chinese language, or teaching how to make Chinese dumplings. It's really much deeper. It's as you said, this Confucius Institute and other Chinese Communist Party establishment in the U.S. society are used as not only stifling the silence, stifling the dissident voices, and there are no teachers in the Confucius Institute is allowed to talk about Tiananmen Square, the massacre, Tibet, or Taiwan. They call it 3T taboos, or now Uyghurs, of course, Uyghur genocide issue, or persecution against Christians. But it's also used as a spying platform. This is pronounced by the bipartisan, in a bipartisan way, with all our national intelligence agencies, FBI head. So they all, said that in public. This Confucius Institute is being used as a spying kind of vehicle. So I'm glad, now some university took steps by shutting them down or make them expired. That, look at Harvard University or Princeton University are reported by the mainstream media that some of the professors have to use a code to describe their Chinese students when they have a class discussion about China's human rights or basic kind of religious freedom problems in the classrooms. For fear of being taken revenge if they speak anything negative about China in classroom. This is where's the academic freedom, right? Let alone some professors were co-opted into the Chinese government system by taking money from them in the name of scholarship or anything. So we already seeing some law enforcement arrest. Taking actions on this many spies the Communist Party installed in campuses.
Well, it's amazing because you literally saw this happen in your education in China. And now you see them doing the same kind of thing here in America, and it's got to be terrifying. When you were, one of the things that you did was you went to the United Nations and you tried to speak out on what was happening. And the United Nations is another body largely controlled by China, which is on the Security Council, and that prevents a lot of critical things happening against them at the council. And you were there, and you exposed what happened in a very bold way. in the midst of, a place where they didn't want to hear the truth, but it was so important. And like it is in the US government. And what did you do, Bob? Because I think people should know how valuable that was to have a voice there.
Yes, Tina, that incident happened when I learned, one of my closest friends and fellow co-workers in Beijing, church, Pastor Cai Zhuohua, was arrested and even sentenced to 3 years for printing Bibles. And he was tortured with the electric shock baton. So I got hold of an electric shock baton and basically going through all the procedures and entered into the UN Human Rights Commission at the time. After my incident, they turned to UN Human Rights Council. And during my sponsored talk, I just turn on that electric shock baton in front of the whole, of course, the UN Human Rights Commission member states in the delegations, including China, for 8 seconds. My goodness, the irony happened was I myself was literally being under like a kind of arrest in the UN hall in Geneva, and my electric shock baton was confiscated and later on was destroyed. And the Chinese delegates went to the UN body, shut down the whole floor and turned off the microphone, and protest said they felt threatened. I mean, the closest delegate, to my seats when I was speaking was, I think, a Palestinian delegate or somebody from Middle East, and they didn't even protest for threatening them. And then I was put in a UN police car, kicked out of the UN building. I still remember that UN guards, by the way, I heard the Chinese government had bribed them by giving them free cultural tours to China, all the UN guards, and so that they can enforce the Chinese law in Geneva in the UN compound. And he went up to me and just scratched on the UN badge, the credential, and forcefully, always hurt my neck, and then put me in a UN police car and kicked me out. And later on, of course, when I testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you were there with Chris Smith, and the UN Deputy Secretary General, and himself acknowledged this, the UN Human Rights Commission was totally dysfunctional. They have a little bit reform after that, but look, now the Chinese government is still hijacking the word human rights body. Silencing any voice that can dare to challenge, their brutality.
Well, and it's amazing to me looking at the way politicians talk about China as though China, they just want to ignore it. We saw Secretary Clinton when she went to China and she just said, look, let's talk about our economic policies. We're not going to talk about the human rights issues. And it's so sad because people like you and others that are there, like Gao and Beijing and these others, they need to be heard. They need to know that they're not forgotten. For you, when you were in prison, somebody had mentioned it and that gave you hope to know, okay, I'm not forgotten. You kept going. And so you need to be at the UN making your voice heard and letting the people in China know we haven't forgotten you. We're going to keep fighting. That this shouldn't be acceptable in this day and age. And, for the Chinese government to want to, be this, a player on the global stage, it requires that they treat their people with dignity and respect. And we can't ignore that. It's so sad to see how much we want to just pretend like what happens in their country is their business. And it doesn't affect us, but it does affect us. We're all human beings. And what's happening to the people in China, ultimately does affect us. Like we saw with COVID this past year, it matters.
It does matter to everyone now. Our life, whenever you wear your masks, or every day when you step out. That's a dark warning reminder of this Chinese Communist Party's impact, influence. I mean, so that's, I think, if we try to appease the Communist Party, and the result is what had happened in Alaska. Those Chinese foreign minister and the Xi Jinping special envoy lectured to our Secretary of State and National Security Advisor of the Biden administration for 23 minutes nonstop, live on camera, broadcast, basically lecture to American people. And that's the consequence of appeasement of the Communist Party.
Well, and you recently experienced this in another way. One thing that I've seen throughout my career that many people may not know is that when you do stand up, you're putting your own life at risk. And the Chinese Communist Party was not so happy with what happened at the United Nations, or with how you've helped so many people get rescued out of China, or how you've brought attention to so many of the issues. And so, in the last year or so, you were facing a pretty significant attack by the Chinese government on you personally. Can you tell me a little bit about, just, in summary, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'd love for you to just summarize how did the Chinese come after you, Bob? What happened?
Yes, that is still so surreal. I mean, so much kind of a shock. After we came to the U.S. as refugees, we felt maybe in a non-biblical way, this is the safest kind of land we can stay here, and as a base to advocate for those who are persecuted in China. And guess what? From late September to early November, the Chinese Communist Party basically sent as many as 90, of those Chinese communists, presumptively, because I have, nothing to do with them, covering their face and staging in front of my house in West Texas, Midland, Texas. And every day from 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock, with 2 cameras broadcasting to millions of people for their propaganda, and basically publicly calling for elimination of Bob Fu. Elimination. I mean, this was so kind of surreal. I mean, the FBI or local law enforcement or mayor had to come to our house for rescue my whole family. So my wife and our children, and then our daughter, who are still studying in high school, were all pulled out from the school building, from our house. And we were under federal protection. I mean, basically, we had to be exiled in a number of different locations in the United States for nearly, 2 months before we can safely return home in Texas. I mean, so that is the consequence, I guess, maybe a price that anyone who speak freedom, especially against the Chinese Communist Party's, brutal rule, we have to be prepared to pay. And, now I feel maybe, biblically, we should never take our freedom or safety for granted wherever we are. And Jesus has never promised that we will have eternal safety in the land of the United States. So we have to always prepare. But, the reality is the Chinese Communist Party is deep, everywhere in the United States.
So the Chinese Communist Party literally went after you on video camera, spread messages through the internet to millions of people, and you had hundreds of people show up at your home and threaten, bully, and harass you and your family to the point where you had to go in the federal protection program in hiding in America.
That's right. Isn't that irony that, we have Texas cowboys here, and but those guys just, showed up every day and make our law enforcement helpless even. They occupied our peaceful street, our neighborhood for the whole month. Yes.
Well, what people don't understand, when I was working on the Hill in Congress on these issues, and the Olympics is coming up again. The Winter Olympics is supposed to be held in China this year, or is it this
2022?
Year? Next year. Yeah. And when the Summer Olympics was being held in Beijing, I forget, was it
2008? Yeah.
2008. We held a number of hearings and briefings on that in Congress. And it was during that time that the Chinese government were going after members of Congress and their congressional staff. And so I actually was visited by an FBI official sometime after that, because the Chinese had also hacked into my email. And it was something I had caught and I had seen. And so I was able to safely protect my email. But, this is what the Chinese government was doing then. I mean, we can't assume that they're going to do anything less than that moving forward. And people should be very concerned, because you are a refugee, you are an American citizen. I mean, myself, I was just a congressional staff at the time, an American citizen, but they're literally infiltrating every single aspect of our society to intimidate and harass average Americans against any kind of criticism of China. And China it is a global superpower. It has enormous power in the world, economically, militarily, in every way. And so we cannot take these things for granted, because the Chinese government wants their way of life, their beliefs, their system imposed not just in China, but around the world. And we've seen that. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it in other places where they've been, and we clearly see it here in America. And I applaud you, Bob, for everything you're doing. And I've always been a fan and a supporter however I can, and having you testifying and supporting you, and I will always do that. But just thank you for your voice and for what you're doing, Bob. It's so important. And you are definitely one of my heroes in the world. I love what you did at the United Nations, and I think everybody that's going to hear this, you're going to be their hero too, because anyone that can take torture instruments into the United Nations and expose what the Chinese government is really doing to people, deserves a lot of praise. So thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's kind of the irony is, after turning on 8 seconds, I mean, they said they felt threatened. I mean, what about the use that torturing, from human rights lawyers, house church leaders, to Tibetan Buddhists, to Falun Gong practitioners, to the Uyghur Muslims for hours, for weeks, for months, years, right? I mean, so that is the reality. But I'm very thankful that you continue to fight, together. I'm really very, very grateful for our partnership together with your mission, with your organization.
Thank you, Bob.